What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video about some of the classes we did not get in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous that I personally would have liked to have seen. Now, to be fair, a reasonable person might look at all of the complexity available in Wrath of the Righteous and its character creation screen and all the classes, and think to themselves, that's probably enough. But if I was reasonable, this YouTube channel probably wouldn't exist. So with Wrath of the Righteous having received its last big DLC, our chances of seeing these are essentially zero. With that in mind, a couple of things. Feel free to just listen to this one. I obviously don't have any footage of them to show you. But also that in a perfect world, before the game had released, I do wish they had gone through the entire list of available classes and removed the things that really just didn't need to be there. There's a lot of, I would say, archetypes that are bordering on effectively useless that the game, I think, would have been better off without, frankly, if only to cull some of that bloat that can absolutely be attributed to character creation at times. Because as a game that has a very high barrier to entry, having choices that will do very, very little for you over the course of the game, such as Defender of the True World, could have been cut, but now that the game's released, obviously it's too late to do that. So in a perfect scenario, I would have loved to have seen those removed and something more interesting put in, such as these classes we're about to go over. Now I'm going to start this off with, I would say, probably the one most are familiar with, and likely the reason you would have clicked on a video like this, and that is the Summoner class for Pathfinder 1E, which I know was a pretty highly requested one, but for whatever reason was never added. Now the Summoner summons an Eidolon, a unique type of outsider that takes one of a few different forms of fantastical looking animal to serve a summoner who it has bonded with, and can then convey a bunch of bonuses and the like to you and your allies. And while the base class itself also comes with things like 6th level spellcasting and a handful of other abilities, really the big thing here is of course the Eidolon itself. Now as you level up, you gain evolution points that you can then spend on customizing your Eidolon, granting it all sorts of abilities and feats, which if I had to guess might actually be the reason this was never added, simply because of the variations here and how it lets you customize exactly what it's up to, whereas regular old animal companions, which can already be very overpowered in this game, without all of these little individual things they can customize, do however get things like their own little animal archetypes that cause them to be quite strong. So I imagine adding Eidolons to that specifically would overshadow that system, to say the very least, but also probably be a ton of work to implement, in the sense that a lot of the evolutions are things that are tied to the base sort of model of what an individual animal companion might do. But as an example, you can take an evolution that gives your Eidolon a different pair of limbs to use, and you can do that multiple times. And then you can give it other evolutions that then add natural attacks to those limbs, giving it just a nonsense amount of attacks if you wanted to, which combined with things like Pounce that you can also add as an evolution would just be ridiculous. And I can see why they didn't want to bother with that, if that is indeed the reason why they never added it to the game. But next up we have an odd case via the Omdura. I believe the actual last class that was added to Pathfinder 1E before they switched fully over to 2nd edition. Now this is a really interesting concept, but right away I think the reason it would have almost never been considered to have been added was purely the fact that because this was added so late into the life cycle of Pathfinder 1E, it only has 2 archetypes and very little support otherwise. But the general idea of this was that you would mix a paladin with a cleric, giving you 6th level spells, but also the ability to adjust typically paladin features to their standard or anti-paladin variant, such as adding cruelties or mercies to their divine touch, or lay on hands basically. They can also use divine invocations, which allow them to grant the entire party either sacred or profane bonuses based on their alignment. And while they don't generally have the ability to use heavy armor, they are otherwise a sort of middle ground between paladin and anti-paladin, but also throwing in some cleric. Specifically though, with their exact spell list and their just innate class abilities, like the invocations granting the entire party bonuses, I think this would have made a fantastic support character that also would have had a ton of flexibility in terms of what party it could be in, thanks to its very open alignment system as compared to a paladin's required lawful good. But speaking of exactly this, another class I think that would have been really cool is the Antipaladin, because you see, Wrath of the Righteous is obviously a very standard jaunt through a holy crusade against demons and the like, and in that regard it's very standard fantasy stuff. And as such, it's no-brainer, obviously, that the Paladin was in there, but as I mentioned, Pathfinder 1E's Paladin is required to be lawful good, which means if you want access to those abilities, you don't really have any other choice. But that's where something like the Anti-Paladin could have come in. And it is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's the Paladin, but in reverse. Instead of channeling positive energy, they can channel negative energy. Instead of smite evil, they get smite good, which I think would be the main hang-up for something like this, considering we are mostly fighting demons. But one thing that I think especially would have been really fun to play around with is Touch of Corruption, which the Omdura could have also potentially gained. And essentially this is Lay on Hands, but in reverse. So instead of healing something for so much, you deal damage to it. And instead of curing an ailment, you could inflict one. So instead of mercies, you get cruelties. These can be things like staggering, paralyzing, stunning, blinding, deafening the target, etc. via a melee touch attack and of course a save against the effect. But all in all, this simply would have given you the option to play a character like a paladin that actually has similar abilities while being evil. And while things like the Hell Knight exist, it's not quite the same, but the reason they didn't add this one specifically is pretty straightforward. They would have had to rework a bunch of these abilities, or simply leave them in as is, and at which point they would be mostly useless because things like Smite Good in this campaign just don't come up very often. And that's probably why they left us with the decent alternative of Hell Knight, which unfortunately just doesn't get quite the same type of abilities, but the general premise is there, at least in terms of class fantasy. But coming in at number 4, we then have the Brawler, a combination of a fighter and a monk that could do some really cool things. In particular, though, there's two things I want to mention. The Brawler got to treat their unarmed strikes as both manufactured weapons, but also natural weapons in terms of qualifying for spells or effects, etc., which might have been why they didn't add this one, because I can't imagine that would have been easy to implement in a system like the PC game here, where those modifiers actually mean something, in terms of code, that is. But along with that little stipulation, they also get increased unarmed strike damage, as this is obviously a bit more hand-to-hand focused. But another cool thing this class could do is that a number of times per day they can take a move action to gain the benefit of a combat feat that they do not actually possess. And as they level up, they can take more and more feats this way all at once. And in fact, at level 20, they can take as many feats as they want this way as a swift action. Though realistically, you would likely have most of them at this point. So it's a really interesting concept, especially because you're not even limited to just unarmed combat. You can also pick up close weapons, things like punch daggers, that you can make flurry attacks with in the way a monk would. And they get all sorts of those bonuses as well. So it's just a really fun combination of monk and fighter that essentially gives you very close to what you would expect from in terms of a monk gameplay-wise, but with obviously a very different class fantasy to go alongside of it. And with a whole host of archetypes to choose from, I think that one in particular could have been really interesting. And then last but not least, probably the most curious of all of these inclusions, and that's the Mesmerist. The Mesmerist is an odd duck of a class in terms of the way it operates, but I think it could have been really cool if it was added. But in terms of reasons why they probably didn't, is that A, they avoided pretty much all of the occult classes because they function a bit odd in comparison to everything else in the game. But in the Mesmerist case specifically, they are a 6th level spellcaster, and a significant portion of their spell list are not spells you can find in the game. So while I think they could have added this one, in terms of mechanics, I think the main thing is that just the spells they use don't seem to be present. But the gist of a Mesmerist is, as it sounds, somebody that is capable of actually getting inside your head, planting thoughts and ideas, and captivating people with their stare, which makes up a big portion of their abilities. That is to say, their hypnotic stare ability, which at a base is a swift action that causes enemies to take a -2 penalty to their will saves. However, as you level up, this gets modified heavily, starting with Painful Stare. So Painful Stare allows a Mesmerist to cause extra damage to any enemy that is caught as the target of its stare, both from allies and yourself, which is already pretty cool. But starting at 3rd level, and then as you level up, you can add more and more effects to this stare ability, including things like blocking their ability to get flanking bonuses against you, applying the penalty to things like damage or attack rolls, effectively debuffing a specific target in a very unique way. And that's to say nothing of their tricks. Beyond just that cool thing, they get what are called tricks as they level up, and these are effectively mental manipulations they place on your party members to aid them when a necessary situation comes up, including things like reflecting various effects back on the attacker, such as ability damage, drain, or bleed. Protecting your allies from ranged attacks is probably a really good one as well, and just all sorts of little stuff like that. And in fact, there are even feats that you could take to augment your stare specifically a little bit farther to make it do things like cause fatigue or simply deal more damage from Painful Stare. So I think the Mesmerist could have been a really cool option, and probably the one on this list I would have personally liked to have seen the most, but realistically, I'd say the main problem is really that spell list that probably in the ballpark of 60 to 70% of is just simply not in the game. But long story short, as complicated and imposing Wrath of the Righteous's character creation can be, it could actually be even worse, which is certainly something to think on the next time you find yourself trapped in character creation. But that's gonna pretty much do it for today. I certainly hope you found this interesting, maybe learned about a class or two that you weren't aware of. But if you have some specific entry in mind, I'd love to hear about it as well. I imagine a couple people will mention gunslingers, but obviously there aren't guns in the game, so that one was never gonna be a thing. And given that if we get another Pathfinder title, it almost certainly will not be 1E, I'd say there's very little chances of us seeing these particular classes anytime soon, to say the very least. And that kind of bums me out a little bit. But that is pretty much where I'm going to wrap up this particular video. And all in all, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.